This week, we've got questions on dissolving parliament, electing a president for life, and are traditional fraternities insufficient to fill the cultural black hole left by Vatican II? Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu, now being broadcast and podcast on the Crusade Channel. Talk radio the way it should be at crusadechannel.com. I'm your host, Vincent Franchini from Tumbler House, here with a sartorial Charles Coulombe.
Sartorial? You mean to say someone who dresses?
Yeah.
So you would say that I dress fairly well. Is that the implication?
Definitely. I think everyone would say that.
Well, I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad to hear it because, not least, because something very strange happened to me this week on just this very topic.
What's that?
Well, you know how Instagram will throw different reels at you of all sorts of things.
Right.
I mean, Murder, She Wrote,
based off
Will
your
and Grace,
interests and engagement.
Golden
Yeah.
Girls. Yeah, well, they obviously are throwing sitcoms and mysteries at me. So I guess that means something or other. I don't know what. But they started throwing at me these fascinating reels that were sartorial advice, believe it or not. Some of them were this black man from Africa or the West Indies, one or the other, and the other a fellow who, by his accent, I would presume to be either a British or a New Yorker or both. But they were giving excellent advice on clothing for gentlemen, and one of them, Peter Barlow, his name is, describes himself as the Ed McMahon of bespoke clothing. I thought it was just great.
That's good.
So, well, the things they had were really marvelous. One of them advised people to, and by people I mean men of a certain girth. They say once you get to a certain age, you've got to decide where your waist is, over or above your gut. He didn't say your gut; he was much more elegant than that. But are you upper or lower? He asked. That's what you have to decide. And he explained the advantages and disadvantages of each in a really, really lovely style. Well, he did the same thing this evening with not wearing a tie with a suit, which you begin to see newscasters doing and all that, which really, it looks bad. And it was very good. So I said, and I do this very, very rarely, but I sent a sort of a fan letter. And what I said was, too true, as was the observation another about the waistline. Keep it coming, Pete. He said, will do. And then, here's where it got interesting. He said, are you the same Charles Coulombe who broadcasts with Vincent Franchini? I think I have seen you on Tumbler House. And my response was, I am indeed about to record another show in 20 minutes. And he said, you are a gift. Enjoyed your talks on the Three Kingdoms of the Habsburgs. Break a leg. Honored to have you here. My response was, very kind. Frankly, you give out the kind of sartorial advice every father should give his sons. Mine gave me, and I give my nephews. So it turns out that Ask Oki is Oki is the black gentleman, and Peter is the white fellow. But they have a bespoke clothing store in New York City on Broadway.
Wow.
So that means you can get your suits made, perfectly tailored, etc., etc., etc. So whenever I get back to my native town, I'll look them up. I mean,
yeah, that's nice.
Like
little bit of a bromance, as the kids might say.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but I would say that it is so good to hear somebody else giving that kind of advice and knowing what they're talking about. Oki himself was on about against the tubular suits, the tight, and he pointed out that this stuff originated in the '60s. I mean, I remember when people were wearing them, and they look passable. I mean, if you're very thin, you can sort of get away with it, but you do look a little bit like a space alien, frankly. And you see that look today. Whereas, you know, a well-made suit covers a multitude of sins.
Yeah. You got me into listening to his stuff a lot too, and I really it's definitely a good message, right? Where I like the way he talks. There's a certain sharpness and a
Yeah.
directness where you hear a knock on the door, you open the door. There's the most beautiful woman you've ever seen, but
Yes.
you're in a hoodie and shorts. you know?
She asks for a cup of sugar,
Yeah.
and you get the cup back in a note, thanking you, and you never see her again. He's quite right. I mean, clothes do make the man. I mean, there should be more than just clothes, but um, packaging is everything in life. You know, my father went through all sorts of ups and downs financially, but he always looked like $1 million. And of course, he was the one I learned to dress from. He taught me how to tie a tie and a bow tie and all that kind of thing. Um, when I was 18, he bought me my first set of formal wear. He said, "You're a man now. You dress like a man." And see, part of the problem, in my humble estimation, is my generation, and I would say Peter is probably an integral part. I'd guess he's maybe 5 or 10 years older than maybe more. I don't know, maybe less. Who knows? Could be younger, but I wouldn't bet on it. And whatever he is, our generation really blew standards right out the window. Now, to be fair, the generation before us, they were eroding pretty rapidly. That's certainly true. But we just blew them to bits. And with what result? And it wasn't just about clothing, it's about everything. It's about behavior, it's about etiquette. For that matter, it's even about smoking and drinking. You know, in the pre-show, I mentioned going to J.J. Fox in London, which is tobacconists. That it was Churchill's. I reminisced about the old tinderbox in Santa Monica. And I'm not saying everyone has to become a pipe smoker or a cigar smoker. That's not my point. But there are certain pleasures that are uniquely masculine. You don't really want a woman puffing away on a cigar or a pipe. There's, although actually, Loretta Young, true story. You know who Loretta Young was? Catholic actress. Now look her up.
Yeah.
Anyway, a friend of mine, came to Hollywood in '51, I guess, and he was invited to a formal lunch in Beverly Hills. And at that time, after meals, the women still left, to go and left the men with their brandy and cigars. And the ladies went off into the drawing room, the withdrawing room, as as it used to be called. So after a little while, Loretta Young came back out, begged for a cigar, and she said, "It's so boring in there with all the hens. I'd rather talk to you men." And so she lit up her cigar and drank her brandy with them. And nobody would ever accuse Loretta Young of not being feminine. But nevertheless, I don't think most women should smoke cigars. I really don't. There is something about being together with a bunch of friends and having a drop or two of something delicious and a fine cigar or a pipe that really, there's nothing like a good smoker. There really isn't. And these are one of the innocent joys that have been taken from us. Um, Anyhow, I'm wandering all over the map with this, but suffice to say, I was pleased as punch at the shout out from Mr. Barlow, and I recommend you all go to Instagram and look up Ask Oki and give a listen to their advice because it's all very, very solid. I mean, honestly, if I were to devote my time to giving sartorial advice, it's exactly what I would say. Everything I've heard from them is precisely what I would say.
Hmm.
So, for what it's worth, there's my endorsement. And but don't blame me, Mr. Barlow, if your profits suddenly drop. Endorsements by me don't necessarily bring you much good. Well, I don't know. And then I don't think we've ever endorsed a product, have we?
Uh, I think maybe once or twice. We've been doing this for 8 years. I'm pretty sure we've done it a handful of times. You meet people, Charles, and
Yeah, but have we ever endorsed a product?
a product.
Campbell's soup.
I don't think so. I don't think so.
All right. Well, you know what? Here and now, I'm going to endorse Pepperidge Farm soups. Now they haven't made them in about 12 years, but
Yeah. Well, if we're going there, you've definitely endorsed products. What, product 19?
yes, all right. There you go.
Right? Like,
I
there's a whole
endorsed.
bunch of these. Like, you were showing me all these different kind of canned items that just aren't done anymore. And yeah, the Pepperidge Farms thing. Yeah.
Yeah, Pepperidge Farm soups, especially the Hunter's soup, ladies and gentlemen, except no substitutes, which won't be hard because you're not going to get any. Well, it's true. And the Campbell's soups, they've gotten rid of all their really interesting stuff. Pepper pot, Scotch broth, stock pot, all gone with the ages. It's like everything is being reduced to this. Ugh. Now, I was in Rule's restaurant in London, which is one of my favorite restaurants anywhere, a couple of weeks ago. And you know what?
What?
They didn't have brown Windsor soup.
Unbelievable. Outrageous.
Well, indeed. This is what I'm being put through, and no one cares.
A silent martyr to minor inconveniences.
Yes, indeed. Indeed. Just like last week. What I've been put through is amazing. And no one cares. No one cares at all. If I tell them I miss the original corn nuts with the giant kernels, I mean, they still have corn nuts, but they're little ones. When corn nuts first came out, they were Lima corn. These big, big kernels. They're delicious. They don't have them anymore. Because they kept with the small ones.
Wow. I wonder why that happened.
I don't know. I could go on and on with small bags of plain Ruffles.
They have other Ruffles. They have nacho cheese Ruffles that are good.
Yeah, but they don't have plain Ruffles in the small bag.
What are you talking about? In a small bag, like a snack?
Yeah. Well, they have the big bag, which I mean you'd only get if you're a hog and you're gonna invest some real time in it, and then you have the small one that you get for a snack. Well, the plain Ruffles do not come in the small bag anymore.
Okay, Charles. I know. What is
And
the
you know
world
what
coming
else?
to?
It's not just that. Pork ramen and pork cup of noodles gone. And even cup of noodles have taken the dried fried egg out of the dried scrambled egg that they used to have.
Wow, I didn't even know there was that in there.
Not anymore.
Or pork. And chicken's pretty good. I mean,
Well,
I
chicken's
don't.
good, so's beef, but I like the pork, and it's gone. See, and I have to put up with all of this. A silent martyr. Well, you know what? I'm ending the silence. I'm breaking the silence. I'm coming out. I'm telling the truth. I am doing what has to be done. I mean, this is the way it is, okay?
Yeah. Okay. I feel you.
What am I supposed to do? I mean, look. I'll have you know that that's not all. The ensemble I'm wearing tonight, the jacket, from Roger Stewart in Los Angeles. The Westgut is a Trachten, local Austrian make. The tie is German. No, it's not. It's Austrian. So you see, I'm telling you, this has got to stop.
What do we do about it? What's cool? Where do we go from here?
Well, I'm reminded when I was a boy, there was a T-shirt back when I was about 13 or 14. There was a T-shirt back before climate change. There was the new ice age, and before that, there was continental drift. And I remember a T-shirt that said "Continental Drift?" ? Write your congressman. So perhaps writing your congressman to demand the reinstatement of Hunter's soup and the other Pepperidge Farm soups. That might be a start. Of what? I couldn't tell you. Did you ever see a movie called They Might Be Giants?
You talk about it a lot. I only know the band.
Well, the band took the name from the film. The film's one of my very, very, very favorites. But at the end, the judge who thinks he's Sherlock Holmes, assembles an army of odd people to bring the war to the enemy, and they do. It's amazing. So that's all I can suggest. However, before we go on to the questions, I've also got to make a calendar note.
Okay.
Are you ready? Can you dig it?
Ready.
Tuesday is April 30th.
Go on.
Walpurgisnacht, May Eve. And all over Central Europe and in Ireland, they'll be lighting bonfires. Now, in folklore, the bonfires were meant to make it difficult for the witches to fly to their rendezvous at various mountains.
Realistically, where does it actually happen? Like let's say, for example, like here in America, if we had that tradition, I can't understand how that would actually play out.
Well, you just build a big bonfire, and some places
like
they
where
jump
though?
to it.
I mean, like what, in your neighborhood?
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I don't
here,
think you can do that.
Right here, they're going to build it outside my window.
I mean, isn't there some sort of like fire hazard or something? You know what I mean? Like,
well, they're used to doing, in this part of the world, they're used to doing bonfires, many times of the year. And so there are different bonfire glades and so forth that people use. And then the next day they'll put up the maypole.
Okay.
And dance around it and so on. But here's the thing. In Germany, which is a big, big bonfire deal, the Minister of the Environment, who's a green lady, let me see.
Uh-oh, here it comes.
Well, she's the Minister of the Environment in Germany, and she's a green. She's never actually had a job. Steffi Lemke. That's the name. Steffi Lemke. She's never actually had a job, but she was a green agitator during college, right? And then after college, she went right into politics and became a professional mouth for the Greens. And then when they went into the government, she became the Minister of the Environment. So she has declared that she wants to put a ban on the bonfires this year for Walpurgisnacht. But it's not for the reasons you think. It has nothing to do with the environment. She claims that the bonfires damage the navigational systems for the brooms for she and her sisters when they're gathering.
Wow.
You wouldn't want to see the environmental minister's broom go down in a blaze of glory, would you?
Did she really complain? Is she really? And you just sort of... Oh, okay.
No.
But that's what I was thinking, I mean, like why that couldn't happen in America because of that sort of
Women
activism.
being women being afraid of their brooms going, their broom navigation system is going on the blink.
Well, also, I mean, America. How many people? It only takes a couple idiots to do it irresponsibly. To be honest.
That's true. And you know, when that happens, the government has to step in. But what if it were the other way around? What if you just had a few government people who were filthy crooks? Would it be possible to intervene and shut down the government the same way they do for us?
If there were only a couple crooks, would it be easy?
Well, it's just like, as you know, a couple of people do something irresponsibly, the government shuts everything down.
Yeah.
So if just a couple members of the government were dishonest or awful, would it then be okay for the public to come in and shut the government down until we straighten it out? You know, until we're sure, until we're absolutely sure. Everybody goes without pay until we're absolutely convinced that it's good. Now that process may take a while, kind of like with the Internal Revenue Service. It may take a little while for us to figure out what's going on. But so until then, no elected officials will be paid. How about that? Cool. You don't know who's on the take, do you? So if you put a moratorium on the payment of elected officials, obviously none of the crooks will get any money. See?
Brilliant.
Well, it's the same rationale they use on us.
It's so true. It's so true. I don't know why it only works one way.
I don't know either. I don't know either. I mean, if the Internal Revenue Service, if you mess up with your income tax, right, the Internal Revenue Service will fine you. But if they mess things up, how come they don't get punished?
Well, I've wondered that for a long time. Like, we're supposed to be hoarding everything, and they had, like, it's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable.
Well, let's say, just give you one example. Let's say you're audited, right?
Yeah.
And they make a mistake. And they ding you for it, but then you're able to prove that actually you weren't wrong.
Yeah.
Well, they may give you the money back that they took from you, but why isn't there a penalty for the agent or agents who messed up?
Isn't there?
No.
I mean, I don't know about such things.
No, why should there be? You're talking about America's brightest and best. Let me tell you something, smart guy. Our president recruited 187,000 new IRS workers. That's more than were recruited for the armed forces this year. So which is more important, merely defending the United States or keeping the wheels of government hungrily eating?
That.
Yeah. Keep that jaw engorging as much as it can. It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Because remember, well, I think I told you last week the motto I've come up with for the Internal Revenue.
What? Yeah, what motto?
Income tax, choosing to share.
Oh, right.
You like that, huh?
It's brilliant.
I thought so. I'm hoping, if you can't beat them, join them. And I'm hoping that somebody will hear this in the Bureau and recruit me. I could get a job for the IRS's PR, and let me tell you, it would totally change. We wouldn't call them IRS agents anymore. We'd call them financial coaches.
Oh, just okay. Don't do that. Just
we're here to counsel.
I don't want our imagination put in that direction. Let's just leave it. Like, if we're gonna talk about you in a government role, Mayor of New York is fine. Let's just keep it there, okay?
But not as a
scumbag IRS publicity person. No.
As an IRS financial coach. Hi, just checking in. If you've earned more than $20,000 this year, You know that you're actually starving people on the other side of the planet? And I know you wouldn't want to do that, now would you?
You know, there's a lot of forces in the world that are designed to pacify the populace, but I think if you engage in that campaign, you're gonna start riots. People are just gonna that's a bridge too far for everyone. We're gonna rise up.
You don't you don't think they'd appreciate that kind of
No,
counseling?
I don't. I mean, it's enough that you're taking all the money. It's another thing that they have to endure torture on top of that. The money's
Torture.
enough. Yeah, that's
It's
right.
guidance. It's
It's
guidance.
guidance.
Guidance. It's not torture, it's guidance. Don't worry about what your children will do about college or school or even food. Worry about helping those less fortunate than yourself. And if you're making over $100 a day, you're more fortunate than most people around the planet. Don't you want to be part of the solution and not part of the problem? What?
Okay, I'm gonna calm down. I'm gonna be a good host, and I'm gonna be a good friendly host. We're gonna go into the questions.
All right, fine. Well, let me just say something totally different and much nicer. Although I think I think if you have your way, my my time as an IRS finance coach will come to a screeching halt, bursting into flames, perhaps. But no, seriously, um, May 1st also means. Are you ready?
Ready.
May 1st is also the beginning of the month of Mary, and so we're going to have May crownings and May processions and the whole Maying experience. You may remember that in the Middle Ages, people would talk about going Maying.
Really? I haven't
Camel.
heard that.
You never heard that phrase?
Maying? No.
Maying,
What's
yeah.
that?
Well, basically, it means going out into the woods and the meadows and fields and picnicking and sort of disporting in the green grass, green grow the Russians so. And basically, in the Middle Ages, they'd wrap leaves in their hair and all that kind of thing. And that was called Maying. Very often they pick flowers. And let me see what it says in terms of Maying. The celebration of May Day, Maying. Going a Maying. This is in Birmingham, England. Which is kind of funny when you consider how industrial Birmingham is. But going a Maying took place on May Eve when young people went out into the woods to collect flowering branches, bringing back the May into their homes at sunrise. The May tree was believed to have special flowers, and bringing its blossom inside thought to be unlucky at any other time than on May Day. The hawthorn is the traditional May tree, but other British trees that blossom at the time include sycamore, rowan, or mountain ash. The custom of children's flower garlands was popular in the 1800s and evolved from the bringing in the May custom usually performed by young adults. After making their garlands, children would go from house to house, singing songs and collecting money. It was also customary for plants to be attached to doors whose names rhymed with the assumed character of the person who lived within. Holly on your door would mean you were thought to be jolly, whereas briar would indicate a liar. Oh, a little bit of rhyming slang there. It's great. And there were also May baskets that were an American custom. You ever heard of those?
Yes, that sounds familiar.
Yeah. So all this is coming up in this wonderful month of May. Plus, it was in the merry month of May. Oh, wait a minute. I was walking in the park one day in the merry, merry month of May. I was taken by surprise by a pair of roguish eyes in the merry, merry month of May.
Oh man, what is that from?
Turn of the century. I've been singing it as long as I've been alive. Uh, But that's a good question. I was strolling through the park one day. Lyrics.
That's like
Yeah.
from Kohan or something?
I don't know who wrote it. Al Sherman.
Hmm.
Um, it's the Fountain in the Park. Ah, here we go. It's from a show, 1894. The Fountain in the Park, also known as While Strolling Through the Park One Day, is a song by Ed Haley, a member of the vaudeville act the Haley Brothers. Some authors believe the song was written by Robert A. Kaiser, to whom Haley dedicated the song. It was published in 1884 by Willis Woodward and Company of New York, but dates from about 1880. It is best known for the lyric "While strolling through the park one day in the merry, merry month of May," and has been featured in numerous films, including "Strike Up the Band" (1940), in which it was sung by Judy Garland. As early as 1938, Shep Fields and his Rippling Rhythm Orchestra recorded the song as a swing jazz foxtrot, entitled "In the Merry Month of May" for Bluebird Records, 1938, featuring the young concert accordionist John Serry Sr. Bing Crosby included the song in a medley on his album 101 Gang Songs. So now you know.
Okay, that's got to be. I mean, between Judy Garland and Bing Crosby, that'll do it. Um, in terms of how everybody knows that song, and
Yeah, well, I mean, it was,
yeah,
everybody knew it in my
yeah,
day.
yeah. All right, let's do some questions.
All right,
Uh,
ready to roll.
Brian has a great question. He says, "I've read that William IV was the last king to dissolve Parliament. What were the circumstances surrounding this?"
Well, that's a good question, and I actually will turn once more to Wikipedia's source of all truth. And here's the deal: uh, the Lord Grey, the Earl of Grey, who was the Whig Prime Minister, wanted to put through a Reform Act in 1831 that would widen the franchise and get rid of the rotten boroughs and things like that in England. So, when the first Reform Bill was defeated in the House of Commons in 1831, Grey's ministry urged, meaning as the government, the cabinet, urged William to dissolve Parliament, which would lead to a new general election. Now, of course, today, when the Prime Minister tells the King to dissolve Parliament, he just does it. There's no question. At first, William hesitated to exercise his prerogative powers to dissolve Parliament because elections had just been held the year before, and the country was in a state of high excitement which might boil over into violence. He was, however, irritated by the conduct of the opposition, which announced its intention to move the passage of an address or resolution in the House of Lords against a solution. Regarding now, see, the thing is, they wanted him to appoint a Tory prime minister against Lord Grey. Regarding the opposition's motion as an attack on his prerogative, and at the urgent request of Lord Grey and his ministers, the king prepared to go in person to the House of Lords and prorogue Parliament. The monarch's arrival would stop all debate and prevent passage of the address. When initially told that his horses could not be ready at such short notice, William is supposed to have said that I will go in a hackney cab. Coach and horses were assembled quickly, and he immediately proceeded to Parliament. Said the Times of the scene before William's arrival, quote, "It is utterly impossible to describe the scene. The violent tones and gestures of noble lords astonished the spectators and affected the ladies who were present with visible alarm." End of quote. Lord Londonderry brandished a whip, threatening to thrash the government supporters, and was held back by four of his colleagues. William hastily put on the crown, entered the chamber, and dissolved Parliament. This forced new elections to the House of Commons, which yielded a great victory for the reformers. But although the Commons was clearly in favor of parliamentary reform, the Lords remained implacably opposed to it. So now you know.
So, so Charles could do that, but typically, if the prime minister asks, what would happen if the prime
No,
minister
no,
asked?
that was then.
Yeah.
Today, you see, one of the things you've got to understand about British governance is that Parliament is sovereign since 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution. This was what King Charles I fought against. It's what the Jacobites fought against. Parliament rather than the king having the final word. But indeed, it did. It does. Now, although 1688 established that principle, the Act of Settlement, uh, it was a long evolution that put us where we are now, where the king basically can say and do nothing without uh, Parliament, or specifically without the Prime Minister as leader of Parliament allowing him to. So, in as late as the reign of Queen Anne, the monarch still presided over the cabinet. But when she was replaced with the German-speaking George I, just by custom, the First Lord of the Treasury became the Prime Minister and the effective ruler of the realm. And the king, you had two of them who were German speakers who were not really interested in Britain. And that was the case until 1760, by which time the party system had really arisen and the Whig oligarchy were firmly in control. In that year, you had George III become king, who was, as he put it, the first of his family to glory in the name of Britain. And he wanted to reform the system, not by going back to 1688, but by regaining the kind of power that Queen Anne had had. So he accepted Parliament's sovereignty, but he wanted to retain his role above party in governance. Unfortunately, the revolution put paid to that idea. And so from that time to this, you've had an increasing division in British governance between the practical and the ceremonial side. Well, bit by bit, William was the last to prorogue Parliament on his own to make that decision. Under Victoria and then the successive sovereigns. I mean, under Edward VII, after Edward VII, they didn't really make any kind of independent foreign policy. And then, of course, Queen Elizabeth was very careful to do whatever she was told, which legacy Charles III has inherited, despite his wonderful name. So that for the king to do otherwise would be basically to lead a revolution, and it would be seen as an attack on the Act of Settlement, which is, after all, why the Windsors are on the throne in the first place. So it's pretty tough. I mean, the king could not refuse his assent to a bill. And that's why, of course, today you'll often hear Catholics attacking first Queen Elizabeth, now King Charles, for giving the royal assent to this, that, and the other. Well, they didn't have a choice. It's not like the presidency of the United States, where they have the president has the freedom to do whatever he likes in this area. He can veto a bill or not. And if he vetoes a bill, you need a 2/3 majority. But if the king now were to say, Le roi s'avisera, which means the king will take it under advisement, not no, to a particular measure, we'd have a constitutional crisis. But the problem, as I say, is not the individual monarch. The problem is 1688 as the so-called Glorious Revolution.
All right. Kind of a related question. Brian asks, how much power do you think parliaments should have? Should there even be one? Politicians always seem to be corrupt, and even if they are good-willed, often have only interests at heart. If they hold the power of the purse strings, aren't they the true sovereign and not the king?
Well, that's very true. And it was partly the point, because Parliament, remember, is a descendant over history of that pan-European phenomenon, the Estates of the Realm. Now, you may remember, or not, that Aristotle, St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Robert Bellarmine all argued that there were three kinds of good government, which had three bad shadows: monarchy, aristocracy, and what they called polity, That is to say, ruled by the majority of the stakeholders, landowners, veterans, etc. These were the three good kinds of government, and then there were three bad kinds that mirrored them: tyranny, oligarchy, and democracy. Well, they then would say that the best kind of government is one that included elements of all three. And that's what you had in the medieval synthesis, as they called it. So you've got the king, who's ultimately responsible for government. You have the first estate, the nobles, and sometimes it was the church, and the second estate was the nobles. And the third estate were the commons. And these uh, basically, if the king needed a new tax, he would go to them, to the estates of the realm, because they were the ones who would have to pay it. You see, in the Middle Ages, the king had a lot of property, and he usually financed the governing of the country through that property normally. But what if you have an invasion? What if you have a plague? What if you have a famine? Well, then you need to raise more money. Well, what do? You call together the people who from whom you've got to raise that money, and you explain why it is you need the dough, and they give it to you or they don't. But usually, I mean, that was what happened in most medieval countries. It was what happened in England. Uh, I guess it would be wiser to say that they had the power of the extraordinary purse, because otherwise, just taxing them without uh, any consent would be a form of theft. Now, mind you, there were certain taxes everyone was expected to pay normally, but anything beyond that, that's when you had to call the estates together. Now, the other thing you would call them for is if there was some emergency or problem facing the realm, and you'd call them for advice, for help. You know, the Vikings are hitting on northern ports. What do we do about it? I call together the great men of the realm. Or do we go on crusade? Or do we do this or do we do that? Um, and that is the milieu out of which Parliament arose. But Parliament at first was not a professional body the way we think of it. They were literally representatives of particular classes. So in the House of Lords, we had the Lords Spiritual and the Lords Temporal. The Lords Spiritual were the bishops, a certain number of them, first of the Catholic Church, then of the Church of England. And in the Catholic days, you had the major abbots as well. And then you have the Lords Temporal, who were the nobility. And those were the two classes that made up the House of Lords. The Commons were made up of representatives of the cities and representatives of the countryside, of the county as a whole. And those latter were called Knights of the Shire. They were literally of knightly rank. And the representatives of the boroughs, if you remember, the boroughs in those days were all sort of run by tiny oligarchies or aristocracies, if you prefer, who sent their representatives literally to represent the interests of the town. None of these were professional politicians. To govern the country, the king had a staff of his own. He had a court, and that's what he governed the country through. A cabinet responsible to Parliament, a standing cabinet like that, did not exist until the reign of Charles II, really. And then under Queen Anne, uh, it became the actual power, without any question. So to answer your question, how much power should Parliament have? Well, depending on what Parliament is made up of. If it is truly representative, not of the political class, but of the various interests in the country, then it should have the power to sign off on any extraordinary uh, expenses being raised out of it, and also to advise and help the king during difficult periods.
Okay. Question from Emilio. Emilio says, I have a question for Charles regarding the Greater Catholic Church in America. I have noticed that among many Ruthenian parishes, particularly in the Northwest, there is an active and conscious effort to bring about an American expression of Byzantine Catholicism. The use of Rusin practices is seen as a great starting point in the road to bring about a truly Catholic, Byzantine, and American mythos that holds things together for the people who practice it. I see a similar trend in the Anglican Ordinariate, where the liturgy doesn't only connect the faithful to God, but also to their own and unique past and lowercase t tradition. Would it be a valid observation to say that the mythos of the various traditional fraternities, such as FSSP and SSPX, etc., is insufficient to fill the cultural black hole left by Vatican II?
Well, that's a very good question. The more so because a lot of what ended up dying in the wake of Vatican II were lay customs, various processions, various feast day customs, and so forth. And also the introduction of the vernacular instead of Latin, especially amongst minority cultures like southern Louisiana, northern New Mexico, Wales. The introduction of the English speaking vernacular had a very bad effect on those. Pennsylvania Dutch, for instance. The reason being that in days gone by, the Mass was in Latin and the priest would preach in German or French or Spanish or whatever the language of the people was. Um, but English was not the language of worship for such places. Vatican II comes along, and most in Louisiana, New Mexico, and so on and so forth, most masses become English instead of Latin. And that accentuates the decay of those languages and those cultures. It happened in New England with the French and the Poles and so forth. So uh, I would say that the question is right in that neither the FSSP nor the SSPX really are attuned, for the most part, there are exceptions, but they're not really attuned toward the rebuilding or regaining of a total Catholic culture amongst their people. Um,
To what extent
to do
is that important in terms of, I mean, a cultural consideration? I mean, um,
well, cultural considerations are very important because remember the culture shapes you. You know, I know when I was a boy, I had to live in two cultures at once. You know, both the wonderful French Canadian and the American Anglo. My father was much more so than me. And this produced a particular mindset. It's a big part of the reason why I'm still Catholic, big part of the reason why he kept the faith. Um, so, honestly, um, it's all important. And of course, you know, when the French Canadian immigrants came to New England, uh, not just with them, but the Poles, Germans, Italians, and so forth. There's a great deal of effort to open up national parishes. And I think they all would have agreed that qui perd sa langue perd sa foi, which is who loses the language loses the faith. Now, what the Revolution Tranquille showed us in Quebec was that you could lose the faith and keep the language. But then if you did, you'd lose your birth rate and you'd become basically Americans who speak French. And you'd stop being what you had been.
hmm.
You know, I had kind of an interesting exchange with a fellow on Twitter this past week uh, because I declared that I was grateful to George III for the Quebec Act and the first Catholic Emancipation Act of 1778. And this fellow, who I presume lives in Quebec, threw the Drapeau de Carillon Sacre-Cœur at me. He sends me a picture of it. He says, "Take that, you Anglo." And then he said another thing, "Vive Québec libre, long live free Quebec." So my response to the first one was, "Thanks, I already have, and it's hanging on my living room wall." And he didn't respond oddly enough. And then I wrote him in French that it was impossible for Quebec to be free because we sold ourselves into slavery with the Quiet Revolution when we gave up the faith. But I said, because the guy used sort of a Germanic pseudonym, I said, given that you've adopted a Germanic name, I doubt you could understand these things. He wants to call me an Anglo, you know. He used a German name.
Okay. But do you see what I'm getting here? I'm trying to represent what I feel like are a lot of people's natural questions, like in terms of, you know, why can't we just have one single? I mean, is it? It's not insufficient, but you're saying something's lacking.
Well,
You know,
something. The problem is the Catholic faith is more than what you do at Mass. It's the entirety of how you live your life. And the problem is, especially when you're trying to raise children, you take them home from Mass, and what are they going to be exposed to? The TV, the school, you know, the usual garbage. And then one day they'll have to choose between the faith and crap, and they won't have an alternative to the crap, you see. They won't have a culture of their own. And, you know, all of us who have kept the faith have had to try to figure out a modus vivendi, a way in which to live in this pagan culture in which we live.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Question from Benjamin, who says, my question for Charles is, how does one properly educate themselves after realizing their indoctrination, kindergarten through 12 plus bachelor's degree, was largely worthless? I studied history, quote unquote, but what I was taught was mostly fiction. What books would you recommend to begin a proper education now that one has realized this?
I'm glad you asked that question. My answer is get my book, Puritan's Empire, and get my first book, Every Man Today Called Rome, which has a long reading list in the back.
That's actually very true, and that's kind of yeah. I can testify to those books for sure. Those are excellent recommendations,
are you in favor of those?
Those are excellent.
You think those are
I highly recommend getting those from TumblerHouse.com too.
TumblerHouse.com. Now, to order, do they throw a brick through the window, or what do they do?
No. To order, they don't throw a brick through the window. We throw the brick through your window.
Okay? Ah, very good. Do they get free shipping and handling?
No more free ship. Well, patrons get free shipping and handling. You patrons, I don't know if all you patrons know about it, but you have a special code, so they do.
So they get free shipping and handling. Should people act now while supplies last?
Yes, they do. Absolutely. Wow, it's been a while since we've done this, huh? But you have to remember, void where prohibited.
Sorry, no CODs.
Batteries not included.
Some assembly required. Operators are standing by.
Be the first on your block.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, and all the rest of those slogans you can think of. So be sure to get those two books and read the bibliographies.
Okay. All right. We just have one last question from
Oh,
Gregoire. And Gregoire says, Dear Mr. Coulombe, I have been watching your videos for a while now from France. Let me tell you, I have found them very inspiring.
thank you.
I have a question for you. What do you think about Alexander Hamilton's project to have the President of the United States elected for life, thereby establishing an elective monarchy de facto? Do you believe it would have been better for America?
That's a very hard question because a man elected as president for life is not the same thing as a monarch trained from birth, coming from a family that are prepared for it. Uh, if it's the usual run of politicians, as we've had in our electoral history, the idea of any one of those guys in there for life would be horrific. Although we have had several who managed it. FDR, JFK was president for life. Uh,
Yeah.
Warren Harding, my favorite president.
Well, yeah, in terms of you're talking about the distinctions between monarchs and coming from a family and trained to rule, and sort of this situation. I remember in previous segments you make a good point that monarchs that they you try to be mindful of the family business, so to speak. You
Yeah,
don't want to just
no,
destroy it and run up the credit card, you know?
no, and of course, even I mean, a president elected for life, on the one hand, does have the ability to make long-term policy, but just about the only advantage of a president for life is that he can make long-term policies. But even that, if he's elected as the representative of one or the other party, having him for life would be intolerable. See, again, the whole point of a monarch is that he's above party. And how you could produce someone through the electoral process who's above party is beyond me.
I feel like a president for life would totally change the American ethos as well, because there's sort of the feeling that if you just get up enough energy and have some activism and get some support, that you can get traction. But or
However,
you vote
however
someone,
untrue that may be.
however untrue that might be, right? And because every 4 years, you can change things, right? But then a president for life kind of changes that. At least that mentality, I would think.
Yeah, I mean, one thing is that George III attempted and George Washington warned against the party system as being inherently the enemy of the common good. But the party system is so much a part of modern governance, both in Britain and America and the vast majority of countries, um, on the one hand, and then on the other, the parties in most major countries have come to be basically identical. They all stand for garbage.
Hmm.
I stand with crap.
So the party system as compared to absolute monarchy.
Well, again, that phrase is a meaningless one. Absolute monarchy did not exist in the sense in which people think of it.
Hmm.
Um, Nobody had power like current governments have. We live in an absolute regime which has the power to change the meaning of marriage, the definition of humanity, and as we saw a few years ago, could shut us down and put us away in our little toy boxes until they're ready to take us out and play with us again. No regime on earth has had that kind of power until now. And now they all do. And most of them don't have the brains God gave a bean. And yet, again, this is the end development of a long process. They didn't simply jump out of the sewer. The sewer was a long time in building.
So what I kind of wanted to explore though, because you almost seem to suggest that the problem is the party system. So
It's a big part of it.
what was the historical alternative to a party system?
Well, historically, the alternative was the monarch. Well, firstly, the vast majority of governance in everyday life took place on the local level. That's the first thing. I mean, remember the traditional monarchy basically had 5 points: the altar, which was the place of the church in determining the rules, the atmosphere, legitimacy, bestowing authority from God, etc. That was the altar. The second was the throne, which was a king or an emperor with authority derived from God via the church, sufficient power to keep his subjects from going after each other and to rally them against foreign invaders if necessary, and to encourage them in all good works they might do. Which is why, if you remember a book called Star Spangled Crown, which you published some few years ago, you'll remember that I go into great detail about the king encouraging the arts and the agriculture and so on and so forth. That was a big part of it. The third was what they would have called local liberties or provincial rights or whatever, what we would call subsidiarity. And that was demonstrated most clearly by the fact that the towns were basically these little republics, really, these little oligarchical slash aristocratic establishments that pretty much ran their own show under the king, connected by a network of highways upon which was the king's highways, upon which the king's peace was maintained, but it was maintained by the locals. You know, the example I always like to use is of we're sitting here in the tavern, and then news comes that a man's playing the playing highwayman, a robber on the king's highway. So the local lawman, whatever he's called, sets out the hue and cry, and he gathers the bunch of us as the posse comitatus, the power of the county, and we go settle the hash of this robber. We bring him back, give him a fair trial, and string him up, and the king's peace is restored. Well, what did the king have to do with all that? Well, to their mind, everything. He was the guarantor of the king's peace. But in terms of practicalities, that was dependent upon his subjects acting in his interest, just as he was to act in theirs. And then the fourth piece was, well, we've spoken of the estates. That was a very important concept. The idea that every group in the realm had its place, had its proper place. And I've said this before, but there's a very common medieval picture that showed a priest, a knight, and a peasant. And they would have something along the lines under each of them, an inscription, something along the lines of, under the priest, I bless all. Under the knight, I defend all. Under the peasant, I feed all. And each of these things was seen as absolutely essential. The idea that they would all act in concert. Well, later on, in the 19th and 20th centuries, people looked at various ways of trying, especially Catholic thinkers, but not just, not only looked at various ways in which that kind of class cooperation, as opposed to Marxist and liberal style class conflict, might be reproduced in modern terms. And they came up with words like solidarism and corporatism and distributism and guild socialism to describe it, all of which are sort of vaguely connected to each other, but focus on different particular aspects, if you see what I mean. So that we would call solidarity today. So altar, throne, subsidiarity, solidarity. And then the fifth was the idea that all the Christian realms belonged to a single Respublica Christiana, uh, a single holy empire, and that wars between Christians were really civil wars and to be avoided at all costs. Of course, they often weren't, but that was the aspiration. And that was why the church in the Middle Ages put through things like the truce of God and the peace of God, which kept fighting onto certain days and away from certain places under pain of excommunication, which was a terrible thing back then. So, um, in such a setup, our kind of governance with a professional political class and all the rest of it is completely alien. Because if you think about it, a lot of what we do is based on ideology. That setup, although you had different groups and parties that fought at each other, Guelphs and Ghibellines in the Germany and Italy, and Armagnacs and Burgundians in France, the Lancastrians and the Yorkists in England, and so on and so on and so on. They did not differ on questions of ideology, but of practical application. Ideology as such didn't exist until really the coming of the Protestant revolt. And then it became a question of remaking society in the particular image that the ideologue had in mind. The idea that this was a self sustaining thing guaranteed by God and really ultimately beyond human tinkering was simply not on the table. I mean, you got to remember, even the way that our ancestors looked at the law was different. Because for us, we think of law as something to be made in parliaments and congresses and bordellos. But well, anyway, but for our ancestors, law was something self existent that human authorities, the monarch and the commons and the lords, or whomever, the estates, whatever it might be, had to discover. But it was already inherent in reality, having been put there by God Himself.
Hmm.
So it was a very, very different approach to not just to governance, but to reality itself.
One of the concepts that my brother was always impressed at that you talked about was in terms of, I think, medieval ideas, was where nowadays there's no intermediary between us and the government. It's
Yeah,
kind of us versus the government.
that's correct.
Whereas,
The intermediary institutions, yeah.
right. So could you talk about that? And it was that part of the equation.
Well, it was. It was part of both subsidiarity and solidarity because every individual was at once a part of several different things. You're a member of the church. You're a subject of the king. You're a member of the church. You're a resident of your particular province. If you lived in a city, you might be a freeman. You might be a member of a guild. You might belong to one or more confraternities that were either both religious in nature or had a specific job. Because one of the things about our ancestors, when they wanted to get something done, they'd establish a confraternity with certain a religious element dedicated to the patron saint of whomever was going to do something. Like let's say you want to build a bridge. All right. Well, you don't apply to the king for money to build the bridge. You form a guild of St. Julian the Hospitalier, the patron of bridge builders, and you raise money to build a bridge, and you build a bridge. And part of it, of course, is that you all go to Mass together on St. Julian's Day. And maybe you endow a chapel in his honor in the local parish church. Uh, but part of the duty of that confraternity of St. Julian the Hospitalier you belong to is getting the bridge built. But that's alongside the religious element. And this was even the case, for instance, in Spain. that was called the Santa Hermandad, the Holy Brotherhood, which had branches all over Spain, and its job was patrolling the roads and maintaining the king's peace. So they were a sort of militia. But, if you broke the law, if you turned the highwayman on the king's highway, the Santa Hermandad would hunt you down. And they could also act as a militia in case of emergencies.
Well, what's preventing that sort of structure now, like people from doing that?
Well, actually, in some places, in some towns, they do. I mean, the cooperatives you have in various places, whether for agriculture or stores or whatever, that's an example of that kind of spirit at work. Except it doesn't have the religious element. So you have, especially amongst agricultural people, well, not solely, you have cooperatives and that kind of thing. You had the original credit unions were based on that kind of activity. We call caisse populaire in French. And they were intended to circumvent the banks who often would not lend money to Catholics or poor people or whatever. So they would set up a credit union which would act like a bank for its members. And the first of these were very often ethnically or religiously based.
What about in terms of kind of how this question started, like defending the people against the government or something like that?
Well, again, a king is very different from a regular government, number one. We are taught from childhood to think of the government as our adversary because it often is.
Yeah.
And we're not really used to any other situation.
Yeah.
But if you have a king who, even if you don't particularly like what he's doing or like him, you know that at the bottom of it, he is seeking the common good. It's a very different relationship from a government staff with politicians who want to milk you like a cow. It makes a difference. I mean, that's why looking at Kazukawa, for instance, there are 30 shrines in his honor scattered across the United States. How did that happen? Well, because he represents a kind of self-sacrificial leadership that we're just not used to.
I see. Wow, that was very inspiring, Charles. Especially that aspect of confraternity, because it almost seems like nothing is stopping us other than ourselves for some of these things, perhaps.
Well, in the immortal words of Pogo Possum, which was a comic strip of my childhood, you remember Pogo Possum?
I don't, but just segueing from what you just talked about to Pogo Possum.
That is part of the joy of doing this show. We have the freedom to do that. You realize we can do anything. We can talk about the Twilight Zone. We can talk about Lost in Space. We can talk about Julia Child. We can compare Mexican food.
Okay, what did Pogo Possum say? What did Pogo Possum? Yeah.
Pogo Possum said, and I quote, "We have met the enemy, and he is us."
Very true.
The original was, "We've met the enemy, and he is ours," meaning we won. But Pogo turned that into, "We have met the enemy, and he is us." And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
All right. Man, we closed strong on this one, Charles. That was really a delight. I'm pretty sure everybody was sort of dazzled by that at the end. It gave us a lot to chew on, a lot to think about. So thank you for that. Any closing thoughts?
Well, yeah. Number one, if you do go to Ask Oki for clothes, tell them Off the Menu sent you. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. They'll appreciate hearing that. But beyond that, um, really, honestly, ladies and gentlemen, it is the month of Mary. I had kind of a revelation when I was in Oxford. I walked from Blackwell's Bookshop to Blackfriars, which is the Dominican church, by the Eagle and Child and the Lamb and Flag, where the Inklings held forth. And I remembered going there in 1992 for the Tolkien Centennial Conference. It was really, really wonderful. It was one of the best times of my life. And then I went to the Randolph Hotel, which in days gone by it was the last bar to close in Oxford. So very often, if we were on a pub crawl through Oxford, you would always end the night at the Randolph. And I sat in the Randolph, and young Daniel Devine was there. He was touring around, but he came and met me there. There were these two, I thought of them as older ladies, but of course they were really my age. And they were there because one of them was retiring. So they're having sort of a girls' night out. And I forgot why we started talking, but we did. And I made the comment, Daniel's sitting there and the two ladies here, I made the comment that, yeah, this is where we would come in the good old days. And they smiled and laughed and said, yes, yes. When all the pubs were closed, there was always the good old Randolph to end up at. And I guess what I'm trying to say is I got a supreme feeling of coziness.
Mm.
And I don't think coziness is a bad thing.
No, it's not. I like how you made this judgment or this realization that these old ladies ended up being the same age as you.
No, it's true. I mean, if I saw me, my first thought would be that's an old man.
That must be strange.
It is. I mean, there's a wonderful internet meme that says it's weird being the same age as old people. And it's very true. And what's funny, thinking about the work of Oki and Peter Barlow. When you say grandparents, what's in my head are the horribly well-dressed people of my childhood. But the grandparents today are people my age, and they couldn't. I mean, they dress like they're wearing paper bags, or gunny sacks or something, ragbagging around. I mean, and I'm really not being funny. You used to look to the old people for decorum and demeanor, and now we're the old people, and we just don't have it. I mean,
No,
I've tried in my little way to do it, but as a generation, we've really, really fumbled it.
it's very true. I walk a lot on the street sometimes, and you see someone from a distance, and you think, "Oh, that's a young person coming at me," and then you get within range, and you see this person is like 60 or 70, and it's like, oh, but and it's because of the clothing that they're wearing.
Yeah. And they don't understand it doesn't make us look attractive.
Yeah.
Because it exposes all of our failings, as it were. I mean, honestly, sometimes more is less, and I'm afraid that except for a few stalwarts like our new friend and various other holdouts on the internet and so on. And there are actually quite a number, believe it or not. Other than that, there's really no real guidance for these questions of style and appearance. And the reason why they're important is because they set the tone.
Yeah. When people have asked me at the office, why I dress up, I actually say it's for me, and it's a reminder to myself that today matters.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's basically treating what you encounter with a certain modicum of respect. Or to put this another way, I've often thought of what I would do if I were a priest and I had to address the question of what people are wearing. Now, as we know, we've known some trads who have, thrown people out if they weren't jacket and tie or a dress, which I think is wrong. But I do think it's a problem that needs to be addressed. So what I would say is I'd get up in the pulpit and I'd say, ladies and gentlemen, what would you wear if you were going to see the president? Now, you come here, you see Almighty God in the Blessed Sacrament. Isn't he more important than the senile guy?
Would people dress nicely to see the president, even if they like the president?
Yeah. Oh, but if that isn't enough, you could say a job interview. People get excited about that when money's involved.
Definitely job interview. That's a good one.
Ooh, money, man. I just thought I'd throw that out there.
Yeah.
But but that's what I would say. You dress up for something you consider important. What does that mean if you don't dress up? It means you don't think it's important. That's what that means. And today, very few of us, judging by the way we prepare for it, very few of us feel much of anything is important. And ultimately, that's a lack of you, a lack of your own self-respect, really.
Yeah.
But I also have to say, when it comes to style, bring back the 1940s style trousers. They go up here with the waist far to the north of the gut. I think that's very important. You know why they got rid of that?
Why?
Material during wartime.
Mm.
I mean, the suits then, they all came up here, which was great. But, you can save this much material if you drop it down about to where it is now.
Hmm.
And they kind of like the income tax, which was an emergency measure. They never got back to it after the war.
If you want to see or hear more discussion about formality and dress and all that, we talked about this I think a year or so ago too a lot. I think we titled it "Losing Formality, Lose the Faith," something like that. So you can search that up in the channel, and that was a really enjoyable discussion on this sort of area, how it's all sort of related. But in any case, I have a question for you. What is it if it's Monday?
Hold on. All right. Ask your question.
What is it if it's Monday?
If it is Monday, it is off the menu.
And what about the soul you save?
The soul you save may be your own.
See you guys.
Did I get it right? Did I get it right?
You got it perfectly, Charles. Well done.
See you next week.